this evening. We're fortunate to have Frank Schaffer with us. I'm Ron Dart. I teach in the Department of Political Science and Philosophy and Religious Studies at University of the Fraser Valley in Abbotsford. We've got Brad Jerzak with us also, who has studied most of Francis Schaeffer's works when he was in seminary. And we're fortunate to have Frank Schaffer with us this evening also. What we're going to do is all ask Frank a couple of questions about L'Abri, about his parents, Francis and Edith Schaeffer, and then Brad will ask questions of Frank, and we'll just continue the conversation from there. Okay, first question is, Francis Schaeffer and Edith and L'Abri have played a very significant role, certainly within the evangelical and Reformed communities from about well, L'Abri was founded in 1955 throughout the late 50s, 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And some hold Francis and Edith high as almost the Holy Eucharist and as icons, and you don't dare criticize them, and other people have tended to see Francis Schaeffer as demeaning and diminishing the meaning of the evangelical Reformed tradition and thinning it out. And so there's been two traditions in regards to L'Abri, one almost idealizing, the other demonizing. And first question really to Frank is, what's the great contribution your mom and dad and L'Abri have made to the evangelical Reformed world, and what may be some of the blind spots within that?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things to say. The first is that, of course, when you talk about anybody's contributions, their ideas, and how they're perceived, there's never one answer, because anybody who lives a lifespan as long as my parents did changes their opinions, and they grow and develop. So first of all, you have to say, which Francis and Edith Schaeffer are you talking about? The second thing you have to acknowledge is that in terms of the larger North American world, the little sliver within the evangelical community that have heard of them does not represent the entire culture. So if you walk up to somebody on the street on Madison Avenue and you say, what does Francis Schaeffer represent? They're going to say, what, the pen, the beer? Who are you talking about? If you ask certain type of evangelical, the kind of people who grew up in the 60s and 70s reading books from University Press, for instance, or who were in seminary or in an evangelical college like Wheaton College, then he would loom very large. So the two things I'd say first is, Francis and Edith Schaeffer are not household names except within an evangelical environment. Secondly, they're particularly well known to people who come out of the environment of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and the beginning of the social conflict that we attribute to the religious right. And then the third thing I would say is that my parents' contribution has to be divided into several parts. It's a little difficult describing what my parents did. I tried in a book, a memoir I wrote called Crazy for God. But the difficulty in summing it up is most people have a trajectory, ideologically or spiritually, that goes in one direction. My father's actually is like this. When he left the United States in 1947, he was a sort of a fire-breathing fundamentalist, Reformed Presbyterian in all his views. As the 1960s progressed and L'Abri was a community of open homes where people came to visit, kind of crashed for the night, to use the lingo of the 60s. At that point, if you went and saw Francis Schaeffer, he had long hair. People were hanging around that were part of the Beat generation and then the hippie generation. As my father always said, he learned more from them than they learned from him. In that he suddenly was leading tours to Italy. When he and I spent time together when I was 15, we hadn't been seeing each other as much as he thought. He didn't take me to some Bible camp. He took me to the Uffizi in Florence, and we started looking at Renaissance art. So the Francis Schaeffer of the 1960s and the 70s, early 70s, was a Francis Schaeffer who introduced essentially ignorant evangelicals to both European culture and philosophy, but in particular to this whole idea that ideas and art and philosophy have consequences and are important. As Dad got into the issue after Roe v. Wade and the legalization of abortion in the United States, because he took a position against the legalization of abortion at that period, and because that became the linchpin of the groups like the Moral Majority and the religious right, toward the end of his life, counterintuitively, you know, a lot of people who start out more conservative and then go more to the left, my father, having gone very much into the area of a cultural analysis of philosophy and art, history, culture, and this kind of thing, very aware of not just the beat poets, but here he was giving lectures on Bob Dylan after Dylan only had 2 albums out. You know, Timothy Leary came to L'Abri in Switzerland and spent a weekend with us, talking to my father. You know, at that point you would have said he was a kind of a religious hippie guru who was giving answers from a Christian position, but you wouldn't have in any way come into L'Abri and said this is a right-wing organization. In fact, your average American evangelical fundamentalist would have been shocked. I mean, there were people up in the woods smoking pot. Nobody was thrown out for having sex. Dad's secretary, his helper in the late 1960s was a lesbian. Now, he wasn't encouraging these things, and he would have maintained the quote-unquote reformed position if asked about the theology. But in terms of how easy he was to get on with and who he was, this was not a founder of the religious right. I mean, you know, you would never, you know, your worst enemy would not wish Jerry Falwell and Francis Schaeffer to be on a desert island together. They would not have gotten on. But because of Roe v. Wade, and because the divisiveness of the issue, the human life issues, and because I came along as a young man at that point and rather opportunistically produced and directed a series of films called Whatever Happened to the Human Race that followed another series called How Should We Then Live that were also had book companions. We made this series with C. Everett Koop that Ronald Reagan then made the Surgeon General because of the series as a kind of a sop to the right, to the evangelicals who had helped him get elected. Because of that issue and because it was a litmus test both for the left and the right, a very simplistic litmus test. If you were pro-choice or pro-life, then everything else followed suit. People didn't then look at my father in a nuanced or balanced way after that. It was that, well, he's pro-life, so he must be all these other things. And there was a vivid moment in realizing that my father was not all those other things when the gay bashing began as the kind of next moral majority issue. And people like Jerry Falwell and others would look to him for some sort of participation or guidance. You know, you've been strong on the abortion issue, so of course you'll be with us on this. And my father would say, no, I'm not with you on this. Gay men and women are human beings, created in the image of God, and this is not my issue. And actually, you know, ticked off some people because he wouldn't do that. There was you know, a bit of conflict with folks like that during that time. And the same came for art and his interest in art. So if you look, for instance, at his book, How Should We Then Live, it's very tame in terms of worldly terms, but you know, there's Michelangelo's David fully nude, genitals exposed. There were evangelicals who were shocked, saying, you know, how could you have this in a Christian book? And my father's reaction was, you're insane. This is Michelangelo. Of course it's in a book on art history. You know, are you out of your mind? What do you want me to do? Start putting fig leaves over, you know, do what some crazy pope in the 17th century did in the Counter-Reformation or whatever later period of history? You know, that wasn't my father. So when you look at his legacy, you have to divide it up. You have to say, which Francis Schaeffer, what period of his life, who are you talking to? Are you talking to some, you know, hippie who was in L'Abri in 1968, who had been a heroin addict in London and Amsterdam and came to L'Abri and crashed there for a summer, straightened out their lives, that Francis Schaeffer talked about art history and what Bob Dylan was singing about? Or are you talking about Jerry Falwell, who took this little sliver of where it seemed my father was supporting his agenda and said, hey, we have a little intellectual respectability because we've got Francis Schaeffer in our corner. And so Dad's legacy, I think, is very complex. And the way I would evaluate it from, I guess, not 20/20 hindsight, but hindsight, as you know, I'm 62, I have 4 grandchildren and a 5th on the way. This is a different period of my life than when I was 20 and helping him there. So from this vantage point, Dad having died in 1984, I would say my father was a remarkable man in that he turned many evangelicals who never would have cracked an art book, never would have gone to a museum, never would have understood that you know, Christian music is not what they thought of as Christian music, but begins with Monteverdi and Bach and the Baroque and all these other things and goes right up into, you know, the current present tense. He opened all those doors for a whole generation of people. Unfortunately, because of what happened with the culture wars that our family was partially responsible for, I don't mean that we started them, but we certainly exacerbated it with some of the film series and other things we did and turned into bestsellers and these other things. Unfortunately, he's remembered for a sliver of activity that really encompassed only the last 6 years of his life. But if you look at the lives he changed, it was not through those activities. It was through the open home of L'Abri Fellowship, where the unloved, the untouchables, the 15-year-old pregnant girl with no place to go, the gay couple who had been thrown out of their church, the pastor's daughter who had gotten divorced and no one else would take in, the drug addict that the local clinic had given up on. Those people's lives weren't changed by an ideologue. They were changed by simple, humane, Christian compassion that transcends the political. And I think that's his true legacy, and it's certainly my mother's. And just to round it out, you know, when my mom died, kind of a funny thing, all through her life she had been an author, and as you know, I write for a living too. And of course, you know, you always want that review in the New York Times. Mom's books, because the New York Times are a little bit snobbish on these issues, never got reviewed in the Times because they don't tend to pay attention to religious books anyway, let alone evangelical books. Although my mom was a good writer and she did some interesting things. But through a couple of connections I had, because they had done the New York Times had done a feature on me quite recently, I called the journalist who had done that, and I told him my mom had died, and he read a long tribute that I'd written to my mother, and the Times reproduced part of it as the basis of a very big obituary. So it took my mom dying to get her coverage in the Times, but she would have thought it was worth it, because she was get reviewed. But anyway, when that ran, plus my tribute that went viral on the internet, I started getting emails from people who hadn't talked to my mom for 40 or 50 years. Literally one from, for instance, I'll give you an example, a hotel maid in New York. Mom was on her way to a book event, some big deal event. Mom screwed up, missed the book event because this hotel maid was crying in the hallway. And my mom stopped the engagement she was on the way to, talked to this person, spent the afternoon with her, and this young woman wound up coming to L'Abri and stayed for a year. And she says, I was a nobody, and your mother stopped an important afternoon's work and instead took care of me. That's my parents' legacy. And those notes, there weren't one or two, there were hundreds. And this is 30, 40 years on. So here we've got people who are my age now, who when they were young, my mother literally was the Good Samaritan. And my father the same. That's their legacy. So I'm very, very proud of my parents. And the funny thing is when people tell me, forget the orthodoxy part, you know, going, where do I go to church, which is the least interesting discussion to have. But just this sort of thing that I've moved beyond my evangelical background in terms of cultural analysis. People say, well, you know, you kind of have moved away from where your parents were. And I beg to differ. I think the lesson I was taught in my youth is one that, by comparison to what mainstream evangelicalism has become, with a sort of a trademark product called God and Jesus, which is a very big business. I was raised in a true faith mission. My dad didn't even have a secretary. We didn't own a car. He worked in a rocking chair on the edge of his bed. So that's the childhood of Christian ministry I remembered. And my departure from American evangelicalism has as much to do with comparing the life example of my parents and their faith ministry to what the rest of all this stuff is that has the same label, but man, it's nothing to do with what my parents were doing, is one of the reasons I bailed and looked for something else. Now for me, I wound up in a different place within the Greek Orthodox Church where I've been going for 25 years, and that's a different story. But in terms of, quote, abandoning my parents' legacy, I would differ. I would say that I would have abandoned my parents' legacy if I had stayed in big-time American evangelical, the big-time American evangelical business, if you like, because that's actually what denied what they did with their lives.
Do you have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was, you know, I was one of those in the 80s who really looked to your dad as almost a savior of evangelicalism. I got his complete works, read them all twice,
Right.
made a poster of the cover of that. It was on my dorm room door in college, right?
Yeah.
And there was this element of like, oh good, now we don't have to be mindless. Now we don't have to be bereft of culture. And so I was very into that. And I also could see how that was then being co-opted too, right? But, and so, you know, master's level course. We watched all of the movies. So that was
You can
my...
thank me for that. I hope you
Thank
enjoyed
you,
it.
I did. And so there was that, but also, like, it felt to me like one area where your dad was ahead of the game was actually making public a faith crisis.
Mm-hmm.
I'm meeting a lot of people now. I'm one of them, you know, where at some point you really have to go be scraped down to the bedrock again and say, okay, when all of that's scraped away, is there anything left of my faith? No one talked about that in the 80s except your dad.
Right.
I'm wondering if you could tell us about that, because it seems like going public with a dark night of the soul, a deep doubt, and then coming through it also gave a real legitimacy to the faith story.
Well, I think the place to start, again, is in personal reminiscence, and that is, my father, when it came to intellectual honesty, you know, no one is completely intellectually honest. I mean, nobody in this room, and nobody anywhere. But that said, my father was intellectually honest in the sense that when he had discussions and debates with people, not so much debates, but discussions, and they asked questions, you know, if he was stumped, he'd sometimes say he doesn't know, or I'll have to think about that. And sometimes would come back and say, I don't think there is a good answer. But then beyond that, he was someone who, I put it this way, you know, there are certain types of conversations where the person you're talking to is not interested in listening to you. They're just waiting to speak their piece. Mm-hmm. And because you have to have a polite exchange, they just switch quiet for a minute. But then, you know, what they're really doing is waiting to jump back in again.
Rehearsing their next.
Rehearsing the next deal. Dad wasn't like that. And I always had the feeling with my father, just on a personal level with him, that he actually would have changed his mind on the big issues which gave him foundations for his own life and solidity. In other words, my father could have well wound up as an atheist or an agnostic or a Buddhist or converted to you know, something completely different. I saw, for instance, change. I'll give you one specific. You know, when in my childhood, you know, we didn't know anything about orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is like when the Greeks or Russians do something or other, but they're kind of like Catholics. You know, they do because nobody knows anything about orthodoxy in the evangelical world, and certainly not back in that period, unless they had been missionaries to Greece or something. You know, which. But to the extent that, for instance, in my early childhood, speaking of the way people change, we were an anti-Catholic family. I mean, they were the whore of Babylon. You know, Spain, Italy, these were dark countries that had to be evangelized with the gospel of Jesus Christ. They had never become Christian. They were pagans as far as we were concerned. When people came up from Italy and they went back saved, then they had to start a Presbyterian church in Milano or somewhere. They never, you know, they were never encouraged to go back to the Latin church. So there's a whole, you can talk about the Orthodox Latin debate, that's a different deal. I'm just saying in our view, you know, it was us, our little family, you know, our church was Dad preaching and 6 people in the living room, and this was the true church, and everybody else was kind of suspect. But when it came to the Roman Catholics or the Orthodox or anybody else, they were way out there. They might as well have been Hindus. They were going to hell. My father, at the end of his life, when he was dying of cancer in Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, there are 2 hospitals in Mayo Clinic. Well, Mayo has a number of hospitals, but one is the Methodist hospital, one's the Roman Catholic hospital. And one time he was lying there after a chemo protocol, and he said, you know, I really changed over my life. And I said, how, Dad? And he said, do you know that there was a time when I was a younger man as a pastor coming to Europe that I was so stupid about these things that I would have told them to take the Roman Catholic crucifix over my bed down. And now I'm glad I'm in St. Mary's and I don't want to be in the Methodist hospital because this roots me into the historic church. And he went further, and I'm not making this up. He said, I no longer think of myself as an evangelical. I think of myself as a historic Christian, and I don't even know what that really means, but I'm not what I used to be. Now, that was a huge admission for my father. This is like, if you had been a child in my family and been at the prayer meetings where we were praying for those lost Roman Catholics, this would be like having been raised in a vitriolically anti-Semitic home. And then toward the end of his life, your father turns around and says, you know, actually I'm considering becoming a Jew. This was a big deal. It's hard to see in this environment because we're all so touchy-feely and everybody, like, we're all Christians and happy-clappy. But back then, in the 1950s, American evangelical missionaries were going to evangelize pagan, lost, hell-bound Roman Catholics all over the world. These were not Christians. So that was the environment I grew up. The end of my life, the end of Dad's life, he was in this other place. And he did the same thing in terms of some of the absolutes of theology. Who's saved, who's lost, what are the prerequisites. Now, in terms of, say, where I'm at today, Dad's changes were within a certain confine. But for him, they were really big. So, my father was intellectually honest enough to change his mind sometimes. And again, that had a big impact on me. But in addition to which, it lifted him out of the propagandistic mode of evangelical discourse, which was the only reason we're putting on an art show is to lure you in here and trick you so you'll accept Jesus. The only reason we have a rock band playing on stage here is not because we give a damn about music or they're any good. They're awful. But hey, it's for Jesus, so it doesn't matter. And in addition to which, what's really important here is the altar call. We're feeding you and you're hungry. We don't care whether you starve or not. The point is, we're getting you in the door so we can slam you with the gospel. And my father was not like that. When we did arts festivals at L'Abri, I can remember in 1968, 70, evangelicals from American evangelical colleges being shocked because, we're having a film festival. It's like, oh, and Christian. No, Dad's, running 3 back-to-back Bergman films and having a discussion afterwards. Or Fellini. And it wasn't as an evangelism tool to get to be cool to young people so I can tell them about Jesus. Dad liked Federico Fellini. And when we went to Italy, where I began to take my journey away from Protestantism into the historic church, which I washed up on the shores of Orthodoxy, but that's, again, a different discussion. But that journey for me starts in Italy as a kid, where my dad is, when he has to write a book about it, he tries to tie up all the loose ends, like we were talking earlier, tied up with a bow. This is what it means. But in person, it was just, hey, this is beautiful art. And so, we're people of the Reformation, and so we've got to say we like Rembrandt better, and we sort of do. But the fact of the matter is, Botticelli is really something, isn't he? And let's stand here and look at the Primavera or the Birth of Venus, because this is it. I mean, this is just beauty. And so, there's the humanistic philosophy, blah, 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 blah. But when you're just one-on-one with these paintings, you're here for the art. And that's where my dad was different. Everything was not a means to an end for propaganda purposes. So when he went hiking in the Swiss Alps, he went hiking because he liked the mountains. He didn't stand there saying, he never gave me all these little platitudinous speeches about, we're looking at this and let's thank God because it's so beautiful and this speaks of creation. It was just, the Swiss Alps are gorgeous, period. Same with skiing, same with art. So Dad was different than evangelicals in that he actually had a sense of the intrinsic worth of creation itself. And again, he didn't know it, but he was priming the pump for orthodoxy because, of course, orthodoxy is a means, a path toward God that runs through a liturgical cycle, which is not afraid of this stuff. It isn't all about your heart and being born again. The liturgical path is one that actually incorporates the physical reality of creation. So Dad was very much someone who was open to these things in a way that other evangelicals were. And he's been censored in the sense that that's not the part that evangelicals want to remember, because L'Abri, as it was, is an embarrassment to them, because it was too open and too free. So they rather take the books, which are tied up in a neat bow and have been edited for InterVarsity Press, Crossway Books, and all sorts of people who never would have printed the most honest book Dad could have written, because it wouldn't fit in the evangelical mold. So what they did is they always did, his stuff was always edited to fit that market. Now, if Dad had lived long enough, he'd be 100 now, but if he could have written in this environment, where you could do what I've been doing with a couple of books that aren't a good fit for a market niche, and just go through Amazon Direct, Kindle, whatever, and just say it, or blogging, it would have been a whole different world. If there had been blogging in the 60s, who knows if Dad ever would have published a book with InterVarsity Press. He would have had a way to communicate with people direct. And he wouldn't have had to go through this channel of, okay, okay, I'll trim this back, a little less of this, let's make it a little more certain sure, you know, let's dot our I's and cross our T's here and make it a little bit safer. And I think that was kind of a bit of a tragedy for my parents, and that is they had to walk within the safety of that North American market niche of evangelicalism. But that's certainly not who my dad was in his essence, I don't think.
Now, in your book, Crazy for God, that came out a few years ago, I actually did a review of it.
Was it a nice review?
Generally,
Okay, all
generally
right.
very kind. But in it, some take the position that you're unduly critical of your mum and dad. And Oz Guinness did a review of the book also, in which he said he lived at L'Abri, which of course I lived just across the street from Oz when in Switzerland.
Yeah.
And he felt that you somewhat caricatured your mum and dad. You'd actually been mean-spirited at times in looking at them. How would you respond to either Oz's, or you've had probably a lot of other strongly negative criticisms of Crazy for
Well,
God?
I'll start at a positive point before I go to the negative. When I started writing fiction and nonfiction as a, quote, secular author, the first novel I published was a book called Portofino, and followed by a novel called Saving Grandma, and then another sequel called Zermatt. And these were works of humor that have done very well, and they've been in, Portofino's been in print for, 20 years, whatever. And they were stories told from the point of view of a little boy growing up in a fundamentalist family of missionaries in Switzerland who went on vacation to Italy, which we did, and were thinly veiled looks at that kind of life through a humorous lens. They weren't about my parents, they were works of fiction, the incidents never happened, but they were framed in a way, obviously, like all writers, you reprocess what you have. Out of those books came all kinds of correspondences from people who liked the books a lot, and people where there was an overlap who had known who my parents were, because the evangelical bookstores wouldn't stock them, because they were both secular and also the laughter was at the expense of a kind of a fundamentalist view of things. So I was out of that market, but there were still people who knew the Schaeffer name and there was a cross. And at that time I would get questions from people saying, what's the real story here? And I didn't want to address it. So my writing career went off into a whole different direction for a while. My son went into the United States Marine Corps, for instance, and I wrote a book which became a bestseller called Keeping Faith, a father-son story about loving the United States Marine Corps. I got interviewed by Oprah, 2020, People magazine, the whole bit. It's just like a whole different life on another planet. So here's this weird thing. All the people who came from L'Abri, some of whom knew about Portofino, none of them ever cracked the Marine book. So actually my identity to most people who have read Frank Schaffer books doesn't even show up on the radar screen of like, how's this fit in with his past? Because, talk about weird stuff from another planet, because I never was in the military. But, I was invited as the guest of honor by the Commandant of the Marine Corps to Paris Island to give a speech. This is not on my planet. So that's just things that happen to writers serendipitously and strangely. After all that happened, because I can't explain this without setting that up, in my 50s, I thought, well, I want to sort out what happened. What was all this about? It's 20 years ago now, 25 years ago, the time's passing. What was happening when I was 22 years old and Jerry Falwell lent me his jet to fly around America to help save it for Jesus and get Republicans elected? Why was Mom swimming laps in Betty Ford's swimming pool in the White House? How come I've got handwritten notes from George Bush and Sr. and Jr.? Who the hell were these people? Us. And so I wanted to sort it out. And I talked to my wife, Jeannie, and I said, there'll be hell to pay, because, of course, all I remembered, I had been out of the evangelical loop a long time. I mean, really out. In other words, like you brought up Oz Guinness, I wouldn't have thought of Oz Guinness or heard of him for 20 years, 25 years. You've got to understand, I was out of the loop. So I'm on Oprah, and I'm on 2020, and they're not asking me about who Francis Schaeffer is. They've never heard of him. They've just heard of this book I've written on the Marine Corps, or whatever it is, okay, or some piece I've written for the Washington Post, whatever. But I wanted to go back and re-examine that part of my life, and I told Gina, I said, but there'll be hell to pay, because what I remembered was when people read Portofino, who, and that was when they were sort of shocked, and there was nothing to be shocked. Anybody reads it, it's just a very mild work of humor, but be that as it may. But all that had sort of drifted away. But in the interim, something had started called the internet, and of course I was starting to get email. I thought, oh, there'll be a storm of negative stuff. It was quite the reverse. So I was expecting nothing but the type of reaction of the few negative reactions I got to Portofino. And instead of that, what I got was email after email, letter after letter after letter, I mean literally 100 to 1, saying thank you for telling our story at last, whoever it was. Because there's been a huge generational journey through the evangelical world that is now incredibly disappointed and jaded. I'm not saying everybody in there, but a big chunk of people who felt that this book at last had taken one of the icons of evangelicalism and actually tried to make a true portrait. Not a negative portrait, a true portrait. But the fact of the matter is, you know, the evangelicals don't have a pope. They have many popes. They have these gurus, you know, C.S. Lewis, Francis Schaeffer, or they borrow somebody like G.K. Chesterton. Of course, the irony is that those three, none of them are good evangelicals. C.S. Lewis is a, you know, like the Orthodox Church, and he's a high church Anglican who didn't believe that you got stuck in hell and wrote The Great Divorce and basically told evangelicals to shove their theology of eternal damnation, so he's not a good evangelical. G.K. Chesterton's a Catholic, and Francis Schaeffer is somebody who's wandering around the Uffizi with his 15-year-old looking at nude paintings. Never mind all that, you know, they have these heroes. Billy Graham would be another, and he would fit them all. So where I would differ with somebody like Oz is that to try to write a book which actually humanizes somebody like my father and mother, who, for instance, in the words of my non-evangelical secular editor in New York, he said, this is the kindest portrait I've ever read of anybody of their parents. It's so full of love and compassion for their many foibles, and it makes them human. But that's because they weren't icons to him.
Yeah.
So you have to understand that when you get to Os Guinness in particular, first of all, he spent his life earning a living off the shadow of having once been associated with Francis Schaeffer. That's his claim to fame. So he's not going to like anybody saying Francis Schaeffer also had feet of clay. Secondly, he's part of an environment where it is big business, and it was illustrated by the fact that his review in Christianity Today magazine, which is where it occurred, in their arts magazine, followed a very glowing, positive review they had published of the book, which was the first review. And they got such a storm came out of that, people saying, you can't like this book. Frank Schaeffer has gone off and become orthodox. He's denied his evangelical faith. Plus, he's critical of evangelicalism. How can Christianity Today be giving it a good review? So all I would tell you, just submitting something for your thought, is I have never heard of a newspaper like the New York Times, or a magazine like Time Magazine, or a U.S. News and World Report, giving a book review to a book, a glowing 5-star review 1 month, next month followed by a slam, because they got such grief for having given it a good review. That's how crocky and stupid the evangelical world is. Because they are a big business. And somebody said, crap, you know, we're selling McDonald's hamburgers, and this guy's come along and he's written a book saying all the beef's poison. You can't say that's good. So let's write another review challenging the science, as it were. That's what that was. It was just big American evangelical, big business hitting back because it had slipped through. The editors obviously hadn't really been aware of what the book was. The Schaeffer name sort of rang a bell. Oh, Frank Schaeffer's written something. Oh, we'll send it down to this southern novelist, a really fine woman novelist in the South somewhere that, you know, she'll write a review. Oh, that's a nice, okay, yeah, it's fine, goes through. It's like, holy cow, what have we done? Because all of a sudden people are saying, do you know what you just gave a 5-star review to? And let's find somebody to slam it. And the only person they could find was someone who had a personal axe to grind. It's not a neutral observer. It's someone who's made their career off the trademark. So it was a very weird circumstance, but more than that, it was the only review of its kind, actually, strangely enough. And the rest of the reviews, I mean, I'm not saying everybody loved the book, but there was nothing else like that. No one else interpreted that book as a harsh attack on my parents. Most people looked at it and said, hey, they might hate the book and they might like it, but nobody read it as an attack. They read it as just like, hey, this is how it appeared to this person. So that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah. Maybe one more question, Brad, and then we'll wind this one down.
Sure. I mean, speaking of that, you know, I ran into someone very shortly after I met you, and had brought up what a good experience that was for me. I want to say publicly, you're one of the most effusive encouragers I've ever met.
Well, that's good.
Thank you.
Thank
It's
you.
really lifted me up, and my friends. So, at the time that I mentioned this, whoever it was I was talking to said, well, isn't that the guy that was so like angry at his parents, you know? And I think they were riffing off the title of the book without having read it, or
Right.
even without having read a review perhaps. But I was able to share with them that I had asked you a similar question at the Wild Goose Festival, and you said, oh no, I adored my dad.
Mm-hmm.
And you gave me a little vignette about how he was ahead of the game even on the civil rights movement.
Right, he
And,
was.
and how he had gathered you as kids to talk about even interracial marriage and so on. I'm wondering if you could share that.
In fact, that all came up just a couple weeks ago again, because it just happens that, I mean, I don't know when people will be watching this, but in the context of when we're doing this interview, a blog of mine that I wrote recently was called The Slow Motion Lynching of President Barack Obama. And as a result of 104,000 shares, which is a lot, not readers, shares, and 102,000 Facebook likes, I started getting on everybody's list in terms of a lot of black entertainers, churches, people, and so forth, and got just a storm of correspondence with folks, and was just on a African-American radio station out of Miami the other day where they were talking about Dad, and I was telling the same story. I said, hey, you know, I grew up in a home where my father in 1964 or 5, early, maybe 63, we had a whole bunch of African students, not African-American, African students, from the University of Sofia in Bulgaria, who were there on scholarships from the Soviet Union when, you know, the US and the Soviets would try to nab students from the third world and train them up to be part of whatever we were all doing. So they were able to come to Switzerland, where my parents' ministry was, because Switzerland was a neutral country in Europe, so they could travel there from Sofia, Bulgaria, where they couldn't necessarily go to, say, the UK or Britain or France or whatever. So we had this group of African students, and my sisters, all older than me, were kind of approaching marriageable age and teenagerhood, and my dad, from literally out of nowhere one time, said, well, we got a household of black men, and I just want my girls to know that if the only question I'd ask you if you fell in love and wanted to marry one, and this is great because it's so evangelical too, was, you know, do they know the Lord? But if they did, you know, there's so many Americans who are racist, not me. If one of you, you know, because these guys were here for 3 months in our house. This wasn't like they're living off in a dorm and, you know, in other words, my sisters are nice, young, presentable women. These are nice young men. And Dad wanted to go on record. You want to fall in love with a black African guy and marry him? Fine. You just got to make sure he loves Jesus first, and then everything's cool. I promise you, in 1963-64, there weren't too many white Protestant American pastors who would bring that out of the blue and want to go on record with nobody having asked the question. Okay, so that's who my father was. Yeah, that's who he was.
Thank you so much. A wonderful overview, and I think has given us a much more positive read from an insider. And hopefully anyone who sees this will have a very human understanding of Francis E. the Schaeffer and Frankie's very positive yet very honest evaluation of his parents. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And by the way, if you want to read the book, it is Crazy for God, and you decide whether I liked my parents or not when you read it.
Very good.
Yeah. Don't just read about the book from somebody else's thing. Read the book. Thank you.
Always best.
Yeah,
Read the book rather
not so
than even
bad.
a review. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you.
Well, we're going to do, now you have the other sort of cycle you wanted to do.
Yeah,
Can
so
I make a suggestion?
Sure. Yeah.
And that is we don't take a break when we cycle straight into the next
Sure.
one.
That's
Next
fine.
one. Because it would be easier